Welcome everyone. We'll start in few minutes. So actually, in few minutes from now, we'll go live to Facebook. So after that, we'll activate all the microphone and everything. So thank you for your patience and thank you for being with us. Good afternoon to all of you from Bangladesh, Dhaka. I know there are places where I have to say good morning and good evening. I welcome you all to the SANEM International Development Conference, SIDC 2020, on COVID-19 and development challenges. And this session is on poverty and human development. I request Honorable Chair, discussant, and all the paper presenters to kindly keep their videos on. Today is the third day of the conference, third and the last day. In last 2 days, we completed 5 successful sessions. From SANEM, we think that this conference is significantly contributing to the public discourse on COVID-19 and its impacts. I welcome and thank the chair of the session, Professor S.R. Osmani, who is a professor of development economics, University of Ulster, UK. 4 papers will be presented. I welcome all the presenters. Thank you so much for your contribution in creating the public knowledge on COVID-19. I also welcome Dr. Saima Haq Bidisha, Professor of Economics, University of Dhaka, and Research Director SANEM, who has kindly agreed to be the discussant in this session. I welcome all the participants from all over the world, and thank you so much for your kind participation and joining us over the last 3 days. And I'm quite sure that your contribution or your interaction with the presenters and all other participants is actually enriching the discussion in this conference. A few housekeeping announcements. The guidelines of the session have been shared with you all. The participants will write their comments, questions in the chat box. As due to the time constraint, we will not be able to allow any participant to speak in the session. The presenters will hear a notification from Mr. Mahatabuddin, who is the research fellow of SANEM, and as well as the timekeeper of this session, at 12th minute that only 2 minutes are left. And a final notification you will hear from Mahatabuddin that your time is over at 14th minute. With this, I request Professor S.R. Usmani to kindly take over and conduct the session as chair of the session. Over to you, sir.
Good morning from Belfast, Northern Ireland. So you can hear me, Salim?
Yes, we can hear you well. Perfect. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So thank you. First of all, thank you, Salim, and thanks, Sanem, very much for asking me to chair this session. And I welcome all 4 participants. I believe all 4 participants are already here, right?
Yes, they are all here.
All 4 presenters, I meant. All 4 presenters, as well as discussant Professor Bidisha, as well as other participants, as you said, from all over the world to this session of the conference. The topic for today's, this particular session, poverty and human development, this session may have come on the last day of the conference, but the topic is of paramount importance in the context of COVID pandemic. There have been other outbreaks of pandemic in the past, but never before has the significance of the pandemic for poverty and human development been as important as it is this time. This is primarily because the very novel nature of the virus that is causing the pandemic. Because of its novelty, scientists, epidemiologists, doctors at the beginning were at a loss as to how to handle this virus. There was no known therapeutic, there was no known vaccine. In other words, there was no tool with which to fight the enemy. So what do? When you don't have a tool, you know that an enemy with overwhelming force is confronting you, and you don't have any tool to fight it. You hope that someday reinforcement may come in the form of a vaccine or a therapeutic, but that's down the road. It's not yet available. So during this period, when you know that you have no tool to fight the virus, to kill the virus, but you're hoping that maybe sometime down the road, a powerful tool would probably arrive. What is the strategy? Think of it as a war situation strategy. You are confined within your fort. There is a enemy of overwhelming power outside the fort waiting to attack you, you'd have no weapons to fight it. You know that sometimes some from somewhere reinforcement come. What do you do in the meantime? In the meantime, the only strategy is to keep the enemy at bay as much as possible by adopting defensive strategy so that the enemy cannot overpower you. In this situation, if you now translate the strategy in the context of a pandemic, it means you can't kill the virus, but you must stop it from spreading fast so that it can do as little damage to you. So it's a damage limitation exercise at the beginning. And this damage limitation exercise must continue until the vaccine or a therapeutic arrives to deal with the enemy effectively. And in order to do this damage limitation, the imperative, the only possible way of limiting the damage is to take measures which will prevent the virus from going from person to person. And the way to do it is to maintain a high degree of physical distancing. People started to call it social distancing, but actually more appropriate term would be physical distancing, because this is a physical proximity that allows the virus to go ahead. So a large scale imposition of physical distancing is an essential initial step to deal with this pandemic. But then when you do that, it has immediate economic and social implications. If you want to stop physical proximity, you have to shut down workplaces, because it is in the workplaces mostly these days. The world may soon may come at some stage where you can do work online. We have started to do that. Today's conference is one example. But in most economic activities, you have to come together to carry out production, to carry out exchange. So in order to fight the virus, you have to impose physical distancing. But if you do that on a large scale, it invariably brings economic activity to a halt. That's what we call lockdown. That's what we call economic shutdown. But when you do economic shutdown, it not only means loss of production, loss of output, it means loss of income, because income comes from production and output. So production stops means income stops. And when income stops, some people suffer more than others. It is the poor, vulnerable people who work in the informal sectors, who have no, first of all, savings to support themselves. There is no social mechanism of supporting the people who get unemployed in the poorer countries that we are talking about. People working hand to mouth as daily workers, informal workers, they are the ones who suffer most. There are already a large number of poor people. They become even more impoverished. And even those who are just above the poverty line, fall below poverty line because of loss of income. So poverty accentuates. And poverty, not only the loss of income has a direct impact on human development, it is the disease incidence itself may cause further damage. So hunger, morbidity, mortality, premature mortality, all these things have a serious negative impact on human development. But that is an eventuality. This loss of income and negative impact on poverty and human development can happen because of the loss of output that is imposed by physical distancing and shutdown. But that doesn't mean we have to accept that negative effect as an immutable fact. It is possible to take measures against it so that you can balance the need for economic shutdown to fight the virus and to need to protect the livelihoods and income of the poor people. How to balance these two concerns is one of the important, or the most important, policy dilemmas and policy imperatives of this pandemic. Some countries have managed it better than others. Most countries have actually, in my view, managed it badly. And towards the very end, in my closing remarks, I shall make some remarks as to why I think most countries have managed this badly. But let us now hear from the presenters of the papers from different countries, from different perspectives. First of all, what has been the impact of this pandemic-induced lockdown on the economies of these countries, and particularly the poorer section of the countries, and how the countries have tried to deal with this consequence, how badly or how successfully. We shall see the evidence for a number of countries. So there are 4 papers in this session dealing with these issues. The first paper is gives an international perspective. The team at Oxford, who have been working on multidimensional index of poverty for quite some time and made some remarkable advances in developing our assessment of multidimensional aspect of poverty. They have done a projection. They have already been doing a projection of how, when the multidimensional index of poverty is going to fall, if at all, over time. And they have given an estimate, given the nature of the pandemic that has appeared and the response that you are doing, to what extent it will prolong the process of bringing down or make it more difficult to bring poverty down to a certain level. In other words, how many years it adds to our effort to fight multidimensional poverty. That will be the task. That's the task of the first paper. And then I shall introduce the topic of the other papers as they come along. So can we now start from with the first paper? There are several authors of this paper. Sabina Alker, whom I know very well, and Dr. Nicholas Carvajal, and Dr. Natalie Queen, and also Dr. Supa. I believe it is Dr. Carvajal is going to do the presentation. Is that right?
Yes, it is, sir.
Okay, so may I invite Dr. Carvajal to present the paper? And as Dr. Salim Rahan has mentioned, you remember that you have only 14 minutes to present your paper. After 12 minutes, there will be a bell or some notification telling you that you have 2 minutes left. So the floor is open to Dr. Carvajal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Osmani. Thank you very much to all the organizers for giving me the chance to present this work. So I will just try to share my screen. So if I succeed, to start the presentation, because I'm conscious of time. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
I'm really sorry. I think I have to just go out of the application and go out. I'm really sorry. I should have done this a couple of minutes back.
In that case, sir, shall we go ahead with the second presentation, and then since he's having some technical difficulties, what do you think? Just wait.
Just give him a couple of minutes as he requested.
Okay, I think
more than a couple of minutes, we can invite the second speaker.
Sure. Okay. So I think he should be in by now.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, great.
Now, I'm really sorry about that.
Okay.
So again, thank you very much for allowing me to present this paper. As Professor Osmani said, this is joint work with Sabine Alkayer, Natalie Quinn, and Nikolai Supa. And just again, very conscious about time, I'm going to have a very brief outline to give some time for discussion and perhaps some comments. Of course, I have to start by presenting you the background and motivation. Then I will be very clear about the research questions that we ask in this paper and the methods that we apply to solve them. And we have basically 2 big parts of the paper. So we deal with the projections of multidimensional poverty, as Professor Osmani said, but also, of course, we have to take into account how COVID-19 affects these expectations of projections. I will discuss the results in some detail, and then I will present some concluding remarks and the way forward that we have for this paper. So, of course, I have to start by mentioning SDG 1 and Target 1.2 in particular. that states that by 2030, we should at least reduce by half the proportion of men, women, and children that live in multidimensional poverty by national definitions. This is important because this statement actually acknowledges that poverty is more than just lack of income, and that we have a manifold definition of poverty. So when we think about poverty, you have a manifold manifestation of that condition. And in that sense, when we think about how to then tackle this multidimensional poverty aspect, we not only have to take into account many things at the same time, because that's called a dashboard approach, but we also have to be very conscious about the extent to which these manifold manifestations overlap. So quoting Atkinson in 2019, a full multidimensional poverty analysis is not only the account of many manifestations, but also their interlinkages. Now, how do we go about that? Perhaps the most widely known way of actually tackling manifold manifestations and their interlinkages is the Alcaran-Foster method, which consists basically of a dual count-of counting approach, where people are identified as being deprived in several indicators, and then a critical number is assessed for them to be multidimensionally poor. Essentially, this method, what it does, is it captures overlapping deprivations at the household level. And in turn, perhaps the most widely known application of this method is precisely the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, which is computed annually with HDRO in UNDP and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative since 2010. So just to have a sense of what that index means very briefly, in 2020, we released the latest version of the index for 107 countries in the developing world, using DHS data and mixed data mostly. And it is basically an index that considers 3 dimensions of poverty: equally weighted, meaning equally important, health, education, and living standards. And within those dimensions, we consider 10 indicators that are also equally weighted. Importantly, perhaps, a person is considered as being multidimensionally poor if they are deprived in the equivalent of 1/3 of those 10 indicators. Now, what is important about this fact is that in 2020, it was the first time that we actually presented some changes over time for this measure for a comprehensive number of countries. So for 75 out of the 107 countries that the index covers, meaning around 5 billion people in the developing world, we had a sense of how this poverty evolved for 2 periods of time. Now, of course, the question that we're going to ask is very important and relevant when we think that we only have 2 points in time. So then again, how do you go about a projection with those in that kind of circumstance, with that kind of limiting information? So the question that we ask in the paper throughout is basically which countries would be on track to have multidimensional poverty as measured by the global MPI between 2015 and 2030. That is the main question that guides us in the study. We present the results for the same 75 papers that are covered in the Global MPI report by UNDP using their microdata. And we apply the Alcaran-Foster method. So basically, we reproduce the Global MPI for those 75 countries. And it is very important to understand that actually the Global MPI as an index is the merge of 2 things. Theoretically, it is understood as an adjusted headcount ratio because it takes into account not only the incidence of multidimensional poverty. How many people, or what's the proportion of people that live in poverty, is of course one part of the problem, but also how intensely they suffer that condition is also part of the problem. So the Global MPI, what it does is it takes into account both the incidence, that is denoted here as H, with the intensity, which is denoted here as A. And it is the combination of both incidence and intensity that gives us the measure of multidimensional poverty. So again, we are measuring poverty not only by the amount of poverty that we see in terms of proportion of people, but we're adjusting that proportion by intensity to respect what we call dimensional monotonicity. For the COVID projections that I'm going to show you, it is important because that allows us to actually detect whether an additional experience of poverty for people who are even already poor is actually picked up in the index. Now, as I said, we cannot go about traditional projection or estimation methods that we can use, for example, in econometrics, because we only have 2 data points for every country. So we basically rely on calibration methods. The calibration methods have been used in many other instances in academia to uncover dynamic trajectories for development indicators, and there are many models for trajectories using calibrations. The most common one and the most simple one, perhaps, is the linear projection that has been applied very often, perhaps in earlier studies, But then it has been reinforced by other models such as the constant relative change, for example, that underlies a lot of WHO and UNICEF projections on child mortality and nutrition. And more recently, actually, you have a logistic model that is proposed by other authors in academia, such as Stefan Klassen and Lange, for example, to project school attendance. So in the paper, we basically investigate what is the performance of these three models that are traditionally posited in the literature to project the global MPI. Now, as I mentioned, the global MPI measure, which I just denote here as M, is the product of both incidence and intensity, okay? Now, this is an identity that has to be respected at all times. So in our projections, we cannot project the three of them separately because they're interdependent. So the approach that we take is we project the partial subindices of M, and we always deduce the projection of M to respect the consistency of the index all along the period of analysis that we use. So just to show how this is done, because I know that there's limited time, please let me focus on how we project incidence, okay? The proportion of people that live in multidimensional poverty. So just focus on panel A here in the figure. Here we plot the level of age that we observe against the average annual change that we observe from the data, okay? Each point is a country. So if we actually try to see what is the best functional form that represents this cloud of points, then basically the exercise amounts to uncovering what's the ordinary differential equation behind the movement of h. So for example, if we see that this cloud of points is best represented by a horizontal line, then that would be evidence in favor of a linear fit or a linear projection model for these countries. However, if we see that this cloud of points is better fit by, say, a decreasing monotonic line, then that is evidence in favor of constant relative change. But if we see that there is a quadratic form that represents this cloud, then that is evidence in favor of a logistic form. So again, the strategy that we adopt in the paper is to uncover the ordinary differential equation behind that movement. We do that for H, we do that intensity, I mean, we do that for incidence, we do that for intensity, and we deduce the trajectory of M once we have the levels and the movement over time for both subindices. So here I just show you some trials that we made, where basically we try to uncover what is the relationship between the annual average change of H that we observe against the level of H, just a linear form. We see that we have a significant effect, but the actual adjustment is quite poor. If we add a second term, we see that the adjustment actually improves fit considerably. And if we add more complicated forms, for example, of H or combinations of A, we see that the fit increases very, very slightly. So when it comes to actually increasing perhaps the complexity of the model, and the gain that we get for the fit is actually not great. That is why, and in the paper we explain it much better, we actually stick to the quadratic representation of H against the change, the quadratic level of H as a predictor of the annual change in H. And more importantly, we actually can test whether these estimates that we find are actually reduced forms of a first order differential equation for a logistic model. So these numbers and this data that we have here actually represent this functional form that I'm showing here, which is precisely the first order differential equation behind a logistic model, which depicts or defines the level of H at every point in time. We apply the same procedure for A, and again, we find that a quadratic form is the best linear fit that we can find for the movement of intensity of poverty over time. And again, we cannot reject the fact that these empirical estimates are actually reduced form estimates of this structural form of the first order differential equation. And then that allows us to posit again a logistic function, which has this shape, as the predictor of the level of intensity of poverty at every point in time. Now, we use that information to calibrate models for every one of the 75 countries that we have in the data. Here I show India as an example. We have 2 data points, here in green for H, the incidence of poverty. So we use those 2 points to calibrate the trajectory as depicted by a logistic model. We do the same thing for intensity of poverty in India, and we deduce the trajectory of the index itself, which is here represented in the red line, okay? We do that for every country. I'm just going to show a glimpse of the results that we get for every country. here you have the 75 countries that we study, and in the vertical axis, you have the MPI value. The dashed line that we have here in black, which is country varying, represents the goal according to SDG 1, meaning half of the value of MPI in 2015. At the top end of this red line, you have the observed value of MPI for every country, in the first time that we observe them. And at the end point, you have the projected value for 2030, okay? And then when we see the red line, we're talking about the logistic model. When we see the green dot, we're talking about the projection for the linear model. And when we see the blue dot, we're talking about the projection for the constant relative change model. Whenever this line crosses the dash, the black dash for every country, it means that the target is met, at least. And we actually find that 47 countries would be on track to have multidimensional poverty, those that are represented here in the right. However,
Representative, you have 2 minutes left.
thank you. We have 18 countries that would not meet the target if observed trends continue, and we have 10 countries for which, if observed trends continue, then the result would be model dependent. Now, that, of course, happens before COVID. To take into account what happens with COVID, we perform an analysis of simulations to see what happens with two key indicators in the index: school attendance and nutrition. School attendance has been disrupted, and if it continues, it can push children out of school. Nutrition, of course, can suffer because of the disruptions in food supply chain and overall availability of food. So we actually use UNESCO and WFP projections to see what would happen to the index with 50% of primary school children being dropped out of school permanently, and different scenarios for undernutrition. So in a moderate scenario, 25% of people who are not facing any kind of food deprivation actually experience that in the world. Then a lower bound would be 10% and a higher bound would be 50%. And we have 6 scenarios. So the combination of these 3 with school attendance. I'm just gonna skip this, and perhaps I can go back in some comments or questions to see how exactly these simulations operate. But perhaps let me conclude with the results. Basically, if we plug these new shocks, these COVID-related shocks, into the microdata that we have for the 75 countries, then we detect that depending on the scenario, poverty levels could actually rise to some time that we observe, to levels that we have observed in the past quite some time back. So for example, in the impact where only we would have a moderate impact on nutrition in the world, then we would go back to poverty levels observed at least 5 years back. And if we combine that effect with a dropout and a permanent dropout of children out of school, say 50% of kids are dropped out of school, then the setback would be actually around 9 years. So to have an idea of what that means, then if we don't prevent these shocks from happening in only 2 out of the 10 indicators that we consider, then we would see around 131 more million people becoming multidimensionally poor in the world. And that number could go up to more than 500 million more people becoming poor. So I will just conclude at that, and I will just mention that this is ongoing work. There is a lot of data that we have to uncover. There is a lot of robustness analysis that we have to uncover. And of course, we have to revise our assumptions in terms of the COVID pandemic as more and better data becomes available as the pandemic unfolds. So I will leave it at that, and I'm happy to go back in the round of questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kavajal, for covering a lot of ground, giving a global picture in a 14-minute presentation. Is not easy, but you have done very well. Actually, come to the end quite well. Thank you very much for keeping to the time and for giving a broad overview of the long-term effect on poverty of the current pandemic, which is gives us a valuable perspective. But we need to complement that global picture with individual country experiences, of course, and that's what you are going to do next. So our next speaker is from Nepal, Dr. Siddharaj Bhatta, Deputy Director, Research Department of Central Bank of Nepal, and he will be speaking on impact of COVID-19 on remittance poverty dynamics of Nepal. So it's over to Dr. Raj Bhatta. Again, you have 14 minutes. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks very much, SANEM family, and thanks, Professor Osmani, for inviting me to present my paper. Let me share my screen. I'm sorry.
I think you need to share your PowerPoint screen. We can see your Facebook screen anyway. Yes,
Is it okay now?
there, and you can put it in the slideshow mode, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much again. So I will speak here about the impact of COVID-19 on the poverty dynamics of Nepal, especially coming out of the shocks in remittances. I've taken the impact of remittances in two aspects: shocks in international remittances and domestic remittances. So, as a background, COVID-19 is a crisis that is health as well as economic crisis, especially in developing economies like Nepal. It has impacted a vast majority of workers because a lot of workers work in the informal sector in the economies like Nepal, and especially the remittance-dependent countries. In remittance-dependent countries, it has hard hit the households that depend a lot on the remittances for their consumption, for acquiring assets, etc. So coming to Nepal, around 60% of the households receive remittances, and out of the remittances, they spend about 80% for their consumption purpose. That's why the remittances shock, especially coming out due to the COVID-19, will have great implications for poverty incidence, especially in the rural areas of Nepal. So this paper just estimates the impacts out of the remittance shocks coming from international remittances and shocks in domestic remittances in the poverty incidence of Nepal. So Nepal has some peculiar features in terms of remittances. The World Bank data shows that Nepal is the fourth country in terms of remittances percentage of GDP, and it occupies 21st position in terms of the remittance received. It received annually $8 billion US, and with that $8 billion US, it occupies fourth position in SAARC region. And remittance also contributes a lot to the foreign currency earnings. Around 2/3 of the foreign currency per year come out of the remittances. So this graph depicts the dynamics of remittance flows in Nepal. The remittance as percent of GDP was just 10% 20 years back, and it increased to almost 30% in 2015-16 and come down to 23% in 2019. In terms of volume, the remittance inflow, the special international remittance inflow was 47 billion Nepalese rupees 20 years back. That increased to 879 billion in 2018-19, and it stagnated almost in 2020. So with respect to the household welfare, remittance play a lot of role. For instance, 56% of households in Nepal receive remittances as per the results of the survey done in 2010-11. And the share of remittance receiving households more than doubled from 23% in 1995-96 to 56% in 2010-11. And the role of especially international remittances has increased over time. Such share of international remittances increased from 55% in 1996 to 80% in 2010-11. And as I mentioned, the remittances play a great role, an important role for household welfare by financing their consumption expenditure. Out of the remittances received, almost 80% are spent on consumption by the households. That's why the remittances have played or contributed a lot to poverty reduction. In Nepal, the absolute poverty fell from 42% in 1996 to 25% in 2010-11 and further to 18.6% in 2018. So this is an incredible achievement of Nepal despite the low growth rate, which was just 4.37% over the 20-year period. So regarding the role of remittances in poverty reduction, there are some empirical evidences. For instance, one study done by the World Bank shows that around 1/5 of the poverty reduction in Nepal can be attributed to international migration and remittances. And there are other evidences too. For instance, Acharya and Gonzalez, Devkota, there are other empirical instances that indicate towards the role of remittances for poverty reduction. So the COVID-19 has impacted the remittance flows in Nepal. There are some projections for remittance inflows, such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, International Monetary Fund. They have projected that remittance inflows to Nepal will decline by more than 10% in 2020. And there are some pessimistic projections by some national organization. For instance, Nepal Policy Institute has projected that remittance could decline by 40% in 2020. So the domestic remittances has also fallen sharply because 62% of Nepalese workforce work in informal sector. Because the COVID-19 has impacted the informal workers severely, the domestic remittances also can be expected to have fallen very sharply. So this chart shows the recent trend of remittances, monthly remittance flows in Nepal. The monthly remittance flows declined very sharply in 2020 April by almost 51%, by 25% in May, and thereafter seems to have recovered. But this recovery is not expected to maintain in the medium term because the migrant workers have returned. There are some estimates by the CAPS Institute that almost 600,000 workers will return to Nepal due to the COVID pandemic. And another estimate by Nepal Association of Foreign Employment Agencies, it shows that at least 500,000 Nepali workers will return home due to this pandemic. And we see the trend of migrant workers. The number of migrant workers fell by 25.5% in 2020, and the number fell for all the major worker destinations, for instance, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other major destination countries. So this shows that the remittance income, especially the international remittances, will decline in the year 2020 and even in 2021. So with respect to the impact of COVID-19 on poverty, there are few empirical estimates made by World Bank and other institutions. They have broadly used the household surveys to estimate such impacts. For instance, in Pakistan, the absolute poverty could rise to 40% from the current 24.3%. There are some estimates for India too, by the World Bank, by the UNDP, and other institutions. So one special case is for Myanmar, where the IFRI Institute has estimated that the poverty rate among the recipient households could increase by 7.5 percentage points. So in this paper, I have used the simulation from Nepal Living Standard Survey data, which was collected in 2010-11 to measure the impact of remittance shocks and poverty. Since the data was some 9 years back, I extrapolated the household income. The base for such extrapolation is the Central Bureau of Statistics has conducted annual household surveys from 2013 to 2017, and I extrapolated the household income by quartiles by the growth rate from the household surveys from 13 to 17. And I extrapolated the poverty line by using the CPI index and extrapolated the remittance income received by the households by the annual growth of per capita remittance in Nepal. So this extrapolation seems quite closer after I simulated the poverty incidence in Nepal in 2019. The poverty rates as well as the provincial poverty estimates are quite closer to the estimates made by the National Planning Commission in 2019. So it makes sense to do a simulation in the extrapolated data rather than the original household survey data. So I take three scenarios. So one is the 5% shock in remittances. Another one is 10 to 15% shock, which I call moderate scenario. And in the pessimistic scenario, the remittance is expected to fall by 20 and 40%. So with these shocks, when I simulated in the household budget survey data, I found that poverty incidence, especially the head count ratio, could rise from 0.87% under the optimistic scenario to 7.53 percentage points under the most pessimistic scenario. So this incidence in poverty could pull 0.2, it could push 0.26 million under the optimistic scenario under the poverty line. And under the most pessimistic scenario, it could push 2.26 million people under the poverty line. So another important aspect of the simulation is that the remittance shock will increase the depth of poverty and the severity of poverty. The depth of poverty is here measured by the poverty gap ratio, and the severity of poverty by the square poverty gap ratio. So
Jacinta, you have 2 minutes left.
So next I simulated under the disproportionate shocks. Because all households are not getting the same shocks. The poorer households who work in the countries with weak social protection programs and who work in informal sectors, they are likely to get higher shocks in remittances. So when I employ higher shocks in remittances for the lower quintiles, the incidence in poverty is a little bit larger. Now, the poverty could rise by 2.21 percentage points under the optimistic scenario and by 8.32 percentage points under the pessimistic scenario. And the impact on the poverty depth and the poverty severity of poverty as measured by the squared poverty gap will be larger under the disproportionate shocks and remittances. Next, I simulated on the relative role played by the shocks in international remittances as well as the shocks in domestic remittances. So the results from this simulation shows that shocks in international remittances will play a great role for the incidence in poverty. For instance, the shocks in international remittances could increase the poverty from 17.99% to 24.48% under the most pessimistic scenario, while shocks in domestic remittances could increase the poverty by just 1 or 2 percentage points only. So this results show that remittance shock could really have some implications in poverty rate in Nepal. It could increase poverty by 7.53 percentage points on the most pessimistic scenario. It could increase the poverty depth. It could increase the severity of poverty by increasing inequality among the poor. So one policy implication from this simulation result is that Nepal needs to extend its social protection program to the most vulnerable groups who work in the countries that have weak social protection and who work in informal sector. So one further work in this area can be to measure the impact on multidimensional aspects of poverty, since the data from the survey is not available in recent time period. the next thing that we can do to improve these impacts is to wait for the next round of the household survey data, and as soon as the data becomes available, it will be more realistic to do simulation on the new data to get a better picture of the impact from remittances. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhatta, for your very clear presentation of the situation. One particular aspect of the situation in Nepal, and it's a very important aspect of Nepal's scenario because Nepal is a very special case, which is among the developing countries, is one of the most remittance dependent countries in the world. And as such, the impact of pandemic on the income and poverty of the country emanates not just from the economic shutdown in the country itself, but economic shutdown in the world at large. Because it is throughout the world at large, in India in large part, but also in other countries in the world where Nepalese workers are working. Economic shutdown on those countries have a serious impact on the incomes of migrant workers, and as a result, the inflow of remittance into the country. And for a country which is so heavily dependent on remittances, the impact can be quite serious. And Dr. Bhatta has given us some projections about the magnitude, of possible magnitude of the effect. Of course, there's a lot more to discuss on these topics, but I'm sure we shall come back to the discussions later. For the time being, thank you very much for sticking to the time limit, Dr. Bhatta. And now I invite the next speaker, Elena Enduka, lecturer, Department of Economics, University of Nigeria, and also a PhD candidate at University of Exeter in the UK. The topic is COVID-19 lockdown measures and social protection in Nigeria. So we have seen a perspective from Asia, and now we shall hear another perspective from an important African country. So over to you, Elena Enduka. 14 minutes.
Thank you very much, Professor Osmani. And also thank you, Dr. Salim, for this opportunity to present my paper. It's pretty much simple. There is no econometrics. I think is the simplest. Well, topic COVID-19 lockdown measures and social protection in Nigeria. What are the challenges? Okay. So this is the overview of what I'm going to be talking about: background, method and data, results, and conclusion. So in terms of background, Nigeria, following the outbreak of COVID-19 and also a confirmed case on January 28, 2022, adopted a lockdown measure or even measures across the states in Nigeria. And the president announced this on the 30th of March, 2020. Again, the government proposed some palliatives, recognizing the economic impact of lockdown measures on Nigerians. But at that particular time, when the pandemic initially started, there was mixed opinion on social media platforms concerning whether or not the virus was real. Some people had the opinion that the virus would not survive a hot weather like Nigeria. So, and a few thought it was political. And the Vanguard conducted a poll, and the results of the poll showed that 33% of Nigerians believe it was real. That was around April. So I thought about doing something with my own skills, because my area is energy economics, using stated preference methods to measure welfare estimates of the energy transition. So I just had that idea of doing a simple research that could give insight into what is happening in Nigeria, the impact of the lockdown measures, and what the government could do. Now, the research questions, we have 6 research questions. The first one is, what is the attitude of Nigerians towards COVID-19 hygiene and safety? What minimum amount of money should be given to vulnerable households who have been worst hit by the pandemic each month? I want to state that before the outbreak of the pandemic, the government was giving around $12 to people who were registered, and that was conditional cash transfer. Poor people who were already registered, who in government register, their names were already in the government register. So they were being given $12 each month as conditional cash transfer. So, but we wanted to know if this $12 is actually enough for these people. It's better to get the opinion of the affected population. However, it was easy because most of them don't have access to the internet. So we resorted to asking other individuals who were not part of that group what they think would be nice or adequate amounts that should be given to these people in this group. So the next question we asked was, what is the willingness to pay to avoid contracting COVID-19?
Did we lose?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Please uh,
I
go
don't know
ahead.
where
Yes, go
you
ahead.
had
We
me.
can hear you now.
Okay, so we use this question to measure the opportunity cost of the lockdown. Because of data problems, it's not easy to actually know what households lost during the lockdown. So we resorted to using stated reference questions. So the fourth research question is, how much money are Nigerians willing to pay for a COVID-19 test if they were to pay? So we anticipated that there would be a time when people will be asked to pay for a COVID-19 test. And actually, it started happening as I saw last time on the news. So the fifth question what is the willingness to pay to avoid contracting COVID-19? We know that people have the tendency to overstate their willingness to pay, so their willingness to accept when asked. So we use this other question 5, as an exploratory question to compare it with what we'll find out from this particular question 4. So question 6, why do people not pay income tax? It's very, very important because we know that government provides social intervention or social protection from income, from tax revenues. So it's important to know why many Nigerians do not pay income tax. So these are the big issues that pose as a challenge to the provision of social protection in Nigeria. Before the lockdown, 53.5% of the population was already in extreme poverty, meaning that more than 1 in 2 Nigerians are poor. They live at $1.90 a day, according to the World Bank. So, and what happened during the lockdown? Permit me to just show you a brief video of what happened during the lockdown, just for 30 seconds, if it's going to be clear.
Elena, I think we are not able to see the video because you just shared only your
It's not
PowerPoint
sharing.
screen. Yeah, so
Oh,
it's not streaming. So probably you can skip that because of the time constraint.
Yeah, I agree. I think you could skip the sharing of the video and just go on with the text, please.
okay, no problem. So in that video, people were fighting over loaves of bread during the lockdown. So the second issue The government proposed a conditional cash transfer of $12.86 for 11 million vulnerable people already in the National Social Register. But the big question is, how about those not registered who have been impacted by the lockdown? And if you go by this percentage, it means that more than 100 million Nigerians are poor. Now, if you add the pandemic to this, then it means more than that are even poor, and the people who were poor are now poorer. So the third issue is that oil accounts for 10% of the GDP and 86% of export revenue. However, because of the pandemic, oil prices have crashed. Another issue is that Nigeria faces a fiscal crisis as the tax to GDP ratio is just 5.7%, lower than Africa's 17.2% average. And I think this is the least, and the IMF recommends, I think, 15% tax to GDP ratio. And again, less than 30% of the labor force pays taxes. So where is the government going to get the revenue to provide social intervention or social protection due to the pandemic? This is a big question. Now, our method, we apply the stated preference method, like I said before, which quantifies the welfare impact of policy intervention. It is widely used in the environment, energy, and health economics. So either the policy is already existing or the researcher creates a hypothetical one. So normally respondents' willingness to pay to enjoy or to avoid a particular good or service is elicited. And likewise, their willingness to accept compensation for damage can also be estimated. So just flip the coin and estimate the willingness to accept. So our data, we designed the survey in Qualtrics and administered online because of the lockdown. Couldn't do it face to face. So we did it from April 16 to May to 2020. And we randomly sent it to adults of 18 years old and above. So our data covered the 36 states of Nigeria, including the FCT. However, we recorded responses from only 28 states. So we had 303 responses. And we can see that this is small, the sample size is small compared to the population. We couldn't help it because Nigerians, on average, are skeptical about clicking on links because fraudsters use links to dupe people. So when you send online surveys to people and ask them to click on, many do not because they are afraid that it might be a scam. So we asked the respondents to rate their knowledge of the virus, and we can see that only 35% had excellent knowledge of COVID-19 at the time when we did the survey. And also we asked them how often they wash their hands with soap in a day. We use this to capture research question number 1. Majority of the respondents said they wash their hands more than 5 times, to 65.3% of the respondents. Now, this is state obligation because the government proposed some palliatives. So we asked them if they had received any form of palliative, money, food items, medicine, and 99.6% of respondents said no, they have not received any. So the palliatives given by the government were just stated in books, not actually it has not actually gone to the people. No, they have not actually received any palliative from the government. So this answers our research questions 3 to 5. So we asked them what they think would be the minimum conditional cash transfer, and the mean value is $116 as opposed to $12 that the government is currently claimed to be giving to 11 million Nigerians. then the willingness to accept compensation is $95. So this is the opportunity cost of each household during the lockdown. So in each month of the lockdown, the opportunity cost of the lockdown to each household is $95.
Diapers bhai,
Now
you have two
willingness
minutes
to,
left.
yeah,
You have two
willingness to
minutes left.
pay, that's no problem. So willingness to pay to get tested for COVID-19, the mean is $31. And willingness to pay, surprisingly, in environmental economics, willingness to accept compensation is usually higher than the willingness to pay, and that's an anomaly. But in this case, we can say that willingness to pay is higher than willingness to accept. So that anomaly breaks down in in a matter of life and death, like COVID-19.
Mr. Nanduka, I think, can you go back to the previous slide, please?
This one,
Yeah, can you please
that,
explain again for others, for those who have not read the paper,
okay,
exactly what
then,
WTP, willing to pay for what?
okay, willingness to pay to avoid
Avoid.
contracting
Yes,
COVID-19.
that's important. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I missed that. So we asked them if they pay income tax, 71% said they do, and 29 no. So what are the reasons why people don't pay tax? About 29% said they are not in any employment. We're not surprised because the unemployment rate in Nigeria is 29.7%. And about 25% said the money they earn is not really income. We are not also surprised because the underemployment rate in Nigeria is 25.7%. So my conclusion, although the government is the lockdown in May, its shocks remain. It would cost the government over $19 billion each month to cushion the shocks. So this is about 53% of the foreign exchange reserves, so it's difficult to do so. And the 12.86 conditional cash transfer is inadequate, as we've seen. However, as already noted, Nigeria faces many challenges that make social intervention difficult, and diversification of the economy is more now than ever before. And also policymakers need to fix the tax system going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nanduka, for your presentation of your findings from your survey, which is, although based on a small sample, it does give some very important insights, some of which we may come to discuss at the end. We now move on to the fourth and the final paper. It's from India, and it moves on from the income dimension to other aspects, education in particular. Effects of COVID-19 on primary education in India. Does it divide the government and private schools more sharply? I think Dr. Indrajit Bairagya will present it. Assistant Professor, Center for Human Resource Development and Institute for Social and Economic Change. There are two other authors, Dr. S. Manasi and Roshan Thomas. So over to Dr. Bairagya.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to SANEM for giving me this opportunity to present our paper, which has been done with my colleagues, Dr. S. Mansi and Roshan Thomas from the same institute. Let me start with this introduction and this motivation of this study. This education has been one of the fundamental rights which has been affected due to the spread of COVID-19 greatly. And as part of the effort to contain this pandemic, this COVID-19 virus, most of the countries temporarily shut down educational institutions. An estimation provided by UNESCO recently, and according to this estimation, about 1.59 billion students are affected from 194 countries all over the world, which constitutes an estimates of 91.2% of total enrolled students. And India as a country alone, 320 million students have been affected due to this pandemic, and out of which about 10 million students are studying at the pre-primary level, and about 143 million are in primary levels. One most worrying fact is that this students' academic skill are likely to be affected negatively due to this lockdown. And as there are a number of studies pointed out in different contexts, certainly, that elongated interactions will have an unequal learning outcome depending on the socioeconomic statuses. Children who are from affluent class better their academic skill, whereas the students from the lower strata showed a declines in their skill. So in the context of India, there are several studies. There is a study conducted by NUPA in 2016 has shown that economic shocks are likely to have a greater impact on children from marginalized communities. And another worrying fact is that the disruption in education could lead to an increase in permanent dropouts among the students belonging to these poor families. But there are very much appreciable responses, innovative responses to address this unprecedented pandemic. One of is this online platform and this remote education. There are several initiatives taken by the government of India as well as different state governments. I have mentioned some of the names, that National Knowledge Network, National Project on Technology, just to promote this online platform for this education during this COVID-19 pandemic. There are several other tools as well, as we know, that Google Classroom, Blackboard, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and others. But certainly this higher interactions with technology promotes learning process and possibilities. However, it may turn out to be a reason for inequality in access across countries in the world, which may further aggravate the digital divide. Because these girls and this less affluent class and the children with disabilities are among the worst affected section, who have the lower access to technology and therefore more likely to be one of the disadvantaged communities in terms of accessing different technologies and electronic means. I have provided some data as per this recent estimations in 2017-18. This NSSO, National Sample Survey Organization, provided these estimations that if we compare this rural and urban figures in terms of this percentage of households with access to computer and internet facilities, we can see a sharp divide between rural and urban. In rural areas, only 4.4% households are having this access to computer, whereas in urban areas, it is 23.4. It is better than rural areas. And in terms of internet facilities in rural areas, only 14.9% household have access to internet facilities. And in urban areas, it is about 42%. So the existing inequality in access to infrastructure and electronic means acts as a platform on which the new education may gets divided. Another worrying fact is that, as it is revealed by several surveys, including ESAR and PISA, then we probe several surveys has pointed out that this learning levels, these learning outcomes in this government school are at the dismal level, and the rural-urban divide has a clear, distinct effect on education. And The decline has been concentrated in government school compared to the private school, with the online classes being concentrated in private school. The worrying fact is that the gap between this private and government school is expected to increase drastically. With this background, the objective of our study is to assess the impact of COVID-19 on primary education in India. The study also examines the transformation of the teaching and learning process through digitalization, with specific reference to primary education due to COVID-19, and how egalitarian is the transformation, explicitly focusing on the differential impact between government and private school-going children. In order to accomplish the objective, we have conducted a primary survey comprising both online and offline mode, because it's very difficult to reach rural areas and government school-going children through online mode. So to some extent, we had to do based on offline survey also. But one important thing we need to mention, this survey is still ongoing, and we have a target to reach 1,200 sample. So far, we are able to complete. So far means when we had submitted the full paper, we are able to complete 377 samples. So the results we are going to present here will provide just a glimpse of the issues, not at all a complete picture. We will be able to capture this complete picture when we are ready with this our data collection. We have chosen this Karnataka state, and our sample is divided, is spreaded over this rural and urban areas in Karnataka, and it is also distributed across 4 divisions and different districts in Karnataka. Karnataka has been chosen for 2 reasons. First, there is a sharp difference between rural and urban areas in terms of internet penetration. And the second reason is, which is most important reason, the state government took the political decision for not conducting online classes for primary school students in government school, while private schools have continued to take classes through online mode, which might have further aggravated the gap between government and private schools. So let me start with this descriptive picture. Here we have presented 2 indicators. First, that study hours at home, and the study hours at home and school. One important thing needs to be mentioned here. Learning outcome has always been an important indicator to assess educational outcome. Due to the paucity of data related to the learning outcomes during this COVID-19 pandemic, we have tried to measure in some proxy way. She may not be that strong, but it will certainly provide some indication of this educational outcome during a COVID-19 pandemic. So the first indicator is a study hours at home. Yes, there is a marginal difference between private and government school-going children in terms of study hours. But when this schooling hours is added with the study hours at home, the differences become substantial. The possible reason is that this government school are yet to start their schooling, because this government school have stopped their classes since March. And but one the questions when they are going to open this government school going children, whether they are ready to access online mode of teaching, whether do they have this access to different types of electronic means which is required to access online teaching. So we have compared between government and private school going children in terms of accessibility of different electronic means. Here we have taken this access to smartphone, iPad, computer, laptop, and broadband connections. And each, in terms of every indicators, it is seen that there is a difference between private and government school going children. Yeah, extent differs based on different indicators, and at the end, we have combined all the 5 indicators and we have constructed an index of resource availability based on principal component analysis. And this difference versus in terms of this every indicators, what we have shown in the last slide, we just checked here whether the differences are statistically significant or not. Yes, these differences are statistically significant. Most of the cases it is significant at the 1% level. And the difference, one important thing is the difference between government and private school in terms of study hours at home is marginal, though it is significant, and the difference become substantial and significant at the 1% level when the study hours at schools are added into it. And
Dear President, you have 2 minutes left.
okay. Here one thing we have shown that between inequality and within inequality, yes, between inequality in most of the cases is higher as compared to the within inequality, but the causality has been tested, this choice of schooling and this impact on this resource availability and this study hours, and this we have used this 2SLS model. That this 2SLS model, one important thing is that here is our this choice of schooling is a binary variable. Therefore, we had to approximate the predicted probabilities, and then that predicted probabilities has been used as an instrument to estimate this final stage equations. So in this probability model, it has been seen that yes, we have used this nighttime luminosity data as an indicator of economic development of a particular district, which has a negative impact of the choice of the government school, because the students belonging to these developed areas, they mostly go for this private schooling. And however, this choice of government school has a negative impact on the study hours, both at home and study hours at home and school. And the variable is here also, this choice of government school has negative impact on this resource accessibility, and the variable is robust across different regressions. One important thing I want to say here, that when we have decomposed these differences between government and private school, the difference is marginal and the decomposition, none of the factors are significant. But when we have decomposed this total study hours at home and school, the coefficient difference becomes significant. But in terms of resource the differences, this endowment differences are significant. That means this endowment, the socioeconomic backgrounds of the students really matters to have this access to different types of resources. Whereas here, even after having this coming from the similar socioeconomic background, they are facing differences because of these differences in the schooling. And so our conclusion is also in the similar line, which I have already shown, that clear differences prevails between government and private school, and technology really has come to us as a rescue. But there is there is a difference in terms of this gap has been intensified between government and private school drastically due to this COVID-19 pandemic. And another important thing is, apart from these differences between government and private school, there is differences also exist by rural-urban divide, gender and socioeconomic status, and the parents' financial and time spent with the children are two important factors for the study hours at home and school. So the policy implications are very straightforward here, that it is vital to ensure that they are used. This finance for education should be used more in a planned way, given that there is a global economic crisis, and long-term planning and sustainable mechanisms should be put in place to handle the education system more effectively. And the specific guidelines must be framed by involving all stakeholders in the process. And this corporate social responsibility accessibility funding should be utilized properly. And this several NGOs have already taken initiatives. I have mentioned some of them, but that proper coordination is required. But innovation has been done, but it is very important that the innovation has to be inclusive of the students belonging to every sections of the society. In an unprecedented crisis, it is also important that the whole situation should be addressed in a delicate manner, as the stress level across society are immense. It has to be slow and steady without affecting the speed of the learning process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bairagya. So we have had now 4 rather different presentations, but all of them pertaining to the broad concept of human capability, of how this pandemic is affecting different dimensions of human capability by weakening human capability, by increasing poverty, increasing access to income, increasing educational divide, and depriving many children of the education opportunities, as in the case of India in case study. Now, although they have a common theme, the impact on human capability, the nature of the papers are quite different in other ways, and I do not envy Professor Saima Hakbedisha, who has the unenviable task of making sense of 4 rather different papers and putting them together within a common thread. The common thread, as I would say, is the one that I just mentioned, the impact of human capability in general. So I now invite Professor Saima Hakbedisha, Professor of Economics, University of Dhaka, and Research Director of SANEM, to discuss the 4 papers together. And I suppose Dr. Bidisha has 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, respectable chair. First of all, let me say that all 4 papers are of very high quality, and I must say that not only in terms of the contribution in the COVID type of literature, but also in general poverty, vulnerability, this type of literature, some of this paper can actually contribute to the literature. And one interesting thing that Professor Osmani just mentioned, that we are often obsessed with the fact of talking about poverty with the headcount poverty rate, and we are talking about GDP growth. But this is interesting, like how these papers actually try to dig down into greater detail, like multidimensional poverty and human capital and all of these things together. So that is actually what we should actually think about COVID, because COVID not only affects the short-term poverty scenario, but can have long-term implication on education and human capital development, all of these things. Now, if I go into the paper, let me just go in the reverse direction maybe. The paper on India, I find it like it's a very neat paper, and this is the type of like the typical econometric work that we expect like with this type of study. So I must say that I really enjoyed reading the paper. So one thing is like I was not very sure like whether it's a combination of online and offline interview, based on online and offline interview. So that is something which I think like you should be a bit careful. If I'm wrong, please correct me. If that is the case, so that may cause some biases. So you have to be careful if that is the case. I'm sure that you have taken into account of this issue. Another thing is like when we are talking about the research question, the link between the study hour and the choice of school, that is one of the key issues that you are trying to estimate and trying to understand. Now, there can be a question like, first of all, that the choice of school, different type of schools have different type of, especially the private and public school, they have different mode of teaching, different type of equipments that it require. Like in the public school, you may not even need some of the things that you may need in the private school, and the private school you may need more study hours. So that's why there's a sort of maybe a bit more justification on focusing on more on the quality of education. So that is something that may be needed for the motivation of the paper. So that is one thing I was thinking. And while saying that, one thing is also important, that if you could provide us some glimpse of what was the pre-COVID scenario, like often it is very interesting to see that what was, because situation has everyone all of the school going children have been affected, and now before COVID what was the situation, so that would be interesting to compare with as well. Another issue that I want to add is, like, when we are talking about the results, there are some very interesting results, and I really like that you try to do the Gini decomposition and you find the between group inequality more important and all of these issues, which is very straightforward. But what I find that some of the results, like you find like rural and urban, gender has not been significant, and rural variable that came, I think, with the opposite sign than we expected. So maybe you may dig down into greater detail why some of the sign of the variables are not prior to the expectation. Is it related to the fact that there is greater penetration of schools in the some type of school in the urban area, not in the rural area, or there is some other justification? In the same manner, I was thinking that when we are doing the second stage regression analysis, some of the variables, like some of the community level variables, often can have important implication as well. So whether there is any way to incorporate some, because most of the variables are what I find that these are like household level variables. So whether there is any community variables can have important implication as well. Now, otherwise, I find that it's a very neat work. So I must congratulate on working on this paper. The second paper is on Nigeria. The paper on the Nigeria is a very different type of question that we often ask. And it's interesting that you have been able to work on this paper or have this type of data. One issue is I was thinking about the sample selection of the sample, because the sample is like 71% is employed household, and if I'm not wrong, and 77% of them pay income taxes. So I was just thinking that I was just googling the labor force participation rate of Nigeria, and I found like it's 58% or 60%. So I was just wondering, the sample that you have, whether they're already educated, workable, and they earn well, whether there is a sample selection issue, whether that represents Nigeria, because I don't know that much of Nigeria. So that is one thing that came into my mind. The second point is like I think for the paper, it looks good if you don't talk about the income tax issue here, because we also found that 77% pay income taxes in your sample. That is already quite high. So I don't think if you focus on the income tax, that often this can distract the reader from the main purpose. And third thing that I want to say that that is also, I'm not very sure whether it's a telephone interview or normal type of or online interview or offline interview. That is one thing that can affect the responses as well, especially when you are talking about willingness to pay or willingness to accept approach. And while saying that, I want to highlight one point, that there is a vast difference between the results that you have found, that willingness to pay and willingness to accept. And in general, as you already mentioned, that in the literature, what you expect, you have found the completely the opposite picture, and that is, and the difference is also very strong. And you're trying to explain that maybe this is because of the COVID type of situation. Now, I'm just wondering, like, when there is a very strong difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept, and because that is based on CV and EV method, often it's said that you need to dig down into the Hickshian assumption, whether the validity of the Hickshian assumption that has been distorted. So that is something maybe in case of explanation that could be very interesting, and that might provide you enough thought that whether there has been any issues related to the assumption related to the consumer behavior, because the difference that you have found, that is quite starking. That is what came into my mind. Now, and another issue is like you conducted the survey in April and May. So I'm wondering that whether there has been any follow-up thing, like what is the situation now? Because now, at that time when you started the survey, maybe the incentive packages has just started to flow. Now, what is the situation now? Because many people might have already access of the incentive packages. So whether the situation may have changed as well. So I don't know whether you have any idea or any interest to do the further study. That would be interesting. For the third paper, that the paper is on remittance and poverty. That paper, one thing actually already the presenter has pointed out, the thing is like it's based on 2010-11 survey. So, and then they have extrapolated the data. Now, I'm just wondering, like when you extrapolate the data for such a long time period, it is often when we work on this data, we know in the context of Bangladesh, we also know that we have the data constraint. Whether it is possible to have any other sources of data, because when you have such a long gap for extrapolation, that may create quite a lot of bias. So that is one thing that you always have to keep in mind. And the second thing that I was just wondering, like when we are working on this, like you use like different very strong differences between the like the shock, like 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, 40%. So I have a question, like in some cases the projection is 5% shock, and in some cases the projection is like 40% shock. Like why there is so much of differences in the projection? Like I think there's a difference between the national agencies and the international agencies. This is just I'm just curious to know why so much of differences are there. And while talking about this, I also must say that you have found quite significant difference between the different provinces and ecological belt. And when you're talking about so much of differences between the ecological belt or provinces, is there any insight? Because I think that maybe you need more storytelling sort of thing, like why some provinces are poverty impact is different, for some ecological belt the impact is different. That is sort of a little not very much present in the analysis, and that's why I was thinking that there can be some broader picture in terms of skill composition, in terms of the countries that are we are observing, and like a broader picture. Like when you're talking about Bangladesh, in Bangladesh, we are finding that the remittance is in fact like it is sort of in increasing trend. So that is sort of a bit contrast to what we are finding in Nepal. So in Bangladesh, there is also one story that probably some migrants, they are planning to return back. So that's why they're sending their remittances back. So what is the situation of Nepal? What do you expect in terms of the future trend? So these things would be very much interesting and motivating for us. And also some comparison with the households who do not have any migrant member. That is, I always find it very interesting, because in that case, like some households, they don't have any internal migrant, they don't have any external migrant. So in those scenarios, what might be the situation, like the local effect on the local labor market, what might be the effect? So these things might be interesting, but I think the data issue is one which is like a bit of constrain your work to some extent, but otherwise it's a very decent work. The one on multidimensional poverty, I must say that I actually learned quite a lot while reading the paper, and it's an extremely interesting work. And this is the way that multidimensional poverty has been captured. That is something actually we also should do and work in that area. Obviously there are some issues related to like because you are providing the shock in two key indicators, so there is obviously a scope of further research, that if further shock is provided to other indicators, what might be the result. That is one interesting thing. And for example, that there has been one important indicator indicator is the living standard indicator, and that there is an asset accumulation. So we know that during COVID, lot of households have been has to save, and there has been a reverse disaccumulation of the assets. So what might be the effect? That could be some interesting insight. And also different countries have acted and have been affected by COVID in a different manner. So in that case, like the country-wide, the shock, like the 50% shock and the 25% shock, you can try about putting different shocks to different, you can have several blocks of countries, and you can try putting different type of shock to different countries. And that might provide more interesting pictures, especially when we are thinking about the developing country and the developed country perspective. So otherwise, it's an excellent paper. So I must congratulate all of the paper presenters. And I think this session has been really enlightening, also because of the fact that we have been able to think about more beyond the traditional headcount poverty rate, which is of course important. And these papers show that long-term future welfare on human capital development and the impact of COVID, that has very important implication as well. And that has been captured in some of the papers as well. And I think that is the novelty of these 4 papers. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Vidisha, for doing an excellent job of discussing 4 other divergent papers in a very comprehensive manner. You have raised some very important points. Some of the points are for clarification, which the authors might be able to answer immediately. And some points you have made as suggestions for further work in the future, which I'm sure the authors will take on board while revising the paper or working more on them. And we shall give them an opportunity to respond to some of the points you have made. But I think if Salim agrees, we should do so after a while, after we take from the audience, from the participants, some of the questions they have raised in the chat box. And once we have come to them, then we can, together with Professor Vidisha's points, they can answer them together. And if more questions come later, we can take them more. So is it all right, Salim?
Yes, it's perfectly all right. Yes.
At the early stage, there was a question which has already been answered actually, but it was an important question. The question was asked by Namira Shamim about the very first paper, the Global Projections of Multidimensional Poverty. And the question was, actually that question also came up in my mind, do the projections take into account the various social protection programs available or being newly introduced in these countries? In other words, do the projections look at only the impact on COVID as if there is no intervention, or do they do so with interventions? And that question was actually answered by Dr. Carvajal in the chat box, and it's quite clear that our projections do not take into account these programs. As some of them are still being implemented, we must take them into account at a later period. For now, the results show the extent of the damage if no countering measures are put in place. So it's a perspective of business as usual. If no action is taken, what will be the impact on the pandemic on long-term poverty? That's quite clear. There was one specific question to Dr. Bhatta from Nepal. And the question was regarding the divergent estimates made by various experts on the possible decline in remittance and its impact, the pessimistic scenario and the optimistic scenario. The range of difference between these scenarios is vast. And the question was, why is it the pessimistic scenario is so much higher, so much double almost the optimistic scenario in terms of loss of remittance income and its impact on poverty? Not only impact on poverty, but in terms of loss of remittance. Why some of them estimate double the loss than others? Perhaps Dr. Bhatta could address this question. alongside the questions raised by Professor Vidisha on this particular paper. Thank you, Dr. Betta. You can come along now.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for the question. I think that the estimates are quite divergent because the most pessimistic estimates of 40% decline in remittances was made during April, May, when the uncertainty of COVID-19 was very high. And the government of Nepal, it made a survey through the embassies at the urban countries that how many Nepali migrant workers are willing to return home. And that survey showed a very pessimistic scenario at that time. And depending on that or from that estimates of the willing returnees migrants, I think the national institutes, national policy institutes, and the UNDP Nepal made such an projection of decline in remittances by 40%. But if we look the updated projection by Asian Development Bank, it is also on the line of the pessimistic scenario. It has projected that remittance to Nepal will decline by 28% in 2020 recently. So there are divergence, but the divergence may be the cause of the time of projection. The projection made during April, May were pessimistic, and the projection made later during June and August are somewhat more optimistic. I think that may be the reason for that.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatta, for making it clear. The next question is directed to the paper on India, and it's a question from Pradeep Kumar Chaudhary. And there is also a question and also a number of observations and suggestions for future work. But focusing on the question itself, it was how the estimation of choice of school is important and linked in the study is not clear. What is, I think, is trying to say that when the econometric study was done, choice of school was, I think, was taken as one of the variables that matter. And I think the question is why is this choice of school a relevant variable in the context of this estimation? So there may be a simple answer to this question, and Dr. Vairagya can answer this question, along with, please, the issues raised by Professor Vidisha. Thank you, Dr. Vairagya.
Thank you very much, sir. Yes, thank you very much, Professor Vidisha, for giving a number of suggestions and raised few important points. So I would like to start answering this first discussions point, then I will come to this chat box, this question raised by Dr. Pradeep. The first one, the important point is raised by Professor Vidisha is this offline and online interview. Yes, you are right that there is a high chance of getting non-response from this online interview. But one important thing we need to remember, it's very difficult to reach this rural parents and the parents from lower socioeconomic background, illiterate, those who do not have smartphone. It is very difficult to conduct online survey from them. But we have tried our best to get as less as possible of this non-response from this online survey, so that we can compare this online and offline. Still, we have to check whether this selection bias are taken care or not. But we have tried our best. And the second point is yes, related to this study hours and choice of school can also be related to this quality of education and this pre-COVID scenario. There are a large number of studies existing related to this quality of education. In fact, we also have done, we have published few papers on this quality of education. But here only the problem is a comparability of the data between pre-COVID and post-COVID. And we had the data for the similar children just before COVID of this learning outcome. We could have come up with another estimation of learning outcome so that we could have made some comparative analysis. But this comparison of this macro picture, yes, we will certainly bring some pre-COVID scenario, but that will give again the background of the study, not in explicit manner in the analysis. It would be very difficult to use those. And then, yeah, some of the important variables are insignificant. Yes, you are right. In fact, these are surprising to us, but we are hopeful that once we are ready with our entire survey, because we have pointed out that these results are just a glimpse. Don't treat these are at final results. So once we are done with our 1200 sampling, then possibly our results, we may come up with some better results. And then community level variables, yes, some of the variables we do have at the community level. For example, this caste, this social groups, and this religion, but we will try our best that we can bifurcate again these social groups across different ethnic communities. And let me come to this Pradeep's point about this choice of school. Yes, there is a debate. In fact, it is this debate is existing for quite some time. The debate is between private choice of private and public schooling, because it is understandable. The quality differs a lot between private and public school. The reasons are different. Different studies are coming with different reasons. In fact, the studies recently means a few years back conducted by Ajim Premji University, they have pointed out, yes, schooling, there is no difference in terms of schooling, but only difference in learning outcome exists between these two types of schools because of the students' socioeconomic background. Because in private school attracts the students from students from higher socioeconomic background, and the learning takes place at home because they are coming from affluent family, their parents are educated, their parents have a higher income, so they can afford tuitions and several other means. So this so when this choice of schooling is an important factor for learning outcome, and we do not have learning outcome here, but we have tried to assess some way educational outcome in terms of this study hours at home and study hours at home and school. We thought that this is an important variable, and the variable has been, as Professor Osmani has pointed out, in the first stage of our regression through COVID model, we have approximated the factors determining the choice of schooling. We have approximated the predicted probabilities of the factors determining the choice of schooling, and then that predicted probabilities has been used as an instrument in the second stage to identify the determinants of this resource availability and the study hours. So that's all. I will take other comments as suggestions, and these comments are extremely important to improve our paper, because the paper is in a preliminary stage. And thanks again for giving your feedback.
Thank you, Dr. Bairagya. There is one question for the Nigerian paper to Dr. Naduka, Mr. Naduka at the moment, hopefully doctor very soon. And this question was also raised by Professor Vidisha. It's about the nature of the sample on which the study has been conducted. Well, there's a question of selection bias, whether there is a selection bias here in the sense that the sample is based on people who are able and willing to click on an online survey. Does it lead to a selection bias whereby who are the people who are willing and able to click? Could it be that they are the better off segments of the society? In that case, it could be a biased sample. That is a question that came from Farheen Islam and also raised by Vidisha. Mr. Vidisha also had other observations on the paper. So may I invite now Mr. Anduka to respond to those questions and comments. Briefly, please. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for those important comments. Yeah, that's a common problem with online survey, because you cannot get to everyone. you can only get to those who have access to online facilities. So it was conducted during the lockdown. So face-to-face could have been the best option, getting to people even in rural areas. In fact, the poorest of the population. But that was the challenge. We couldn't do that because of the lockdown. Like you said, you recommended a follow-up study. I agree with you because now the lockdown has been eased. So we could do another survey, using face-to-face, and that could change the results, perhaps. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your brief response, Mr. Nanduka. So finally, turning to the Oxford paper, as I mentioned initially, there was a question from the audience which has already been answered by Mr. Carvajal. But Professor Bidisha had a number of other comments and observations. So may I request Dr. Carvajal to come back and to respond to those comments and questions from Professor Bidisha very briefly again. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Bidisha. And indeed, I think your points are very well taken, and you've actually pinpointed. Our study is our best attempt at what we call an ex-ante evaluation. So basically, it took place at the very early stages in the pandemic where actually non-action was taken. So it is kind of a worst scenario in that sense. And of course, countries have reacted, and some of them more rapidly or better than others, and that is not taken into account in our study. Now, of course, that needs to be updated. But in the end, I think we have two kind of venues for the paper. So we intend to have a global study for which country heterogeneities have to be taken into account, but also the avenue opens up to kind of country level analysis, where data deficiencies are going to be very present. And I guess that I would just say that as the pandemic unfolds and as we actually know better and governments are reacting in a more informed manner, new data is becoming available. So for example, UNDP through the Crisis Bureau has an ongoing national representative surveys about certain livelihood aspects, for example, like asset possession that you mentioned, that are taken, but not in the 75 countries that we have, but in a handful of countries, for example. So we can have in-depth studies about what happened with this particular aspect, thanks to ongoing and data that is being generating as we speak. So yeah, I mean, several things are needed to improve the paper, but all your points are well taken, and hopefully we will have time and the energy to work on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Carvajal, for this brief but relevant response. And from the chat box, I can see a number of suggestions which the authors can take on board while revising the paper, but no immediate question for clarification, etc., that is relevant for immediate discussion. So if Salim agrees, then can you bring this open floor discussion to a close now?
I think so, sir, because of that time constraint.
Time constraint as well.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay, so thank you everyone, the authors of the papers, Professor Bidisha for her excellent overview, and the participants who have been quite generous in terms of their comments and questions, which are valuable. We have not discussed all of them here, but they're available and the authors can take note of them while revising the papers. See, what all these papers have brought out, one common feature is that the pandemic is having a very serious effect all over the world, not just, we have not discussed the developed country experience here, but if you do, then it's everywhere, all over the world. It's taking a heavy toll on human capability in terms of their ability to avoid hunger, morbidity, mortality, to be able to continue to education in all aspects of human capability. It is taking a heavy toll. In response, in my view, and in view of many others, not enough is being done, particularly in the developing countries, but also in some of the very developed countries. Not enough is being done to protect this negative effect on human capability. on their income, livelihoods, hunger, education, etc. And if you ask the politicians, why aren't you doing enough? The first thing they'll say, well they'll say that, so what most of the cases what they're doing is, they're trying to find a cheap way of avoiding this negative impacts on income, livelihoods, poverty, and etc. The cheap way is trying to open up the economy quickly. So removing the restrictions on physical distancing, removing the restrictions of lockdown quickly, hoping that people get back to work quickly, and therefore the negative impact will be minimized. That's not going to happen. If the economies open up too soon, then the pandemic will only become worse and linger for much longer. And the longer it lingers, the more negative will be the impact on income and livelihoods of the poor people. So you cannot actually solve the problem by premature opening. You must maintain a sufficiently long period of very strict lockdown in order to bring the pandemic under control. Not to conquer it completely, you will never conquer it until the vaccination comes along. But in order to control it, to minimize loss of lives from the virus, every country must maintain a sufficiently long period of very strict lockdown, which most countries are not doing. And if you ask them why are you not maintaining lockdown, the standard answer politicians gave, sometimes they give the answer in the name of the poor people. They say that if we maintain the lockdown for long, then the poor people will suffer because they will not have the income, they will not have the opportunity, employment. So we do it for the sake of poor. But that's a disingenuous argument. If you want to do it for the poor, then maintain the lockdown, but at the same time, give adequate support to the poor people in terms of income. And when you say you give them adequate support, the normal answer is, can we afford it? It will cost so much money, a huge percentage of GDP. And the poor countries afford it. Again, that's a disingenuous answer. If a war, an actual war, countries would not have asked the question, can we afford to conduct the war? They will not surrender simply saying, we don't have the money to conduct the war. They will conduct the war by mobilizing the resources. They will make short-term sacrifices by cutting down other expenditures. They will draw upon the future by borrowing, find various ways of conducting the war. And this is the warlike spirit that should be applicable here, that we must do it. We must provide the support to our vulnerable population, maintain the lockdown, but at the same time provide adequate support to our vulnerable population with a warlike footing, with a warlike emergency, and then we'll find the resources. The problem is that degree of priority is not given to income support and support to the poor people in general. And I think one of the reasons why they don't give that degree of importance is a misperception about the role that this kind of income support plays in the context of the pandemic. The general tendency is to see this income support as an unfortunate cost on the economy. The pandemic is imposing a cost on the economy by forcing the government, the politicians, to pay out handouts to the poor people. But this cost-centric view then leads to a certain degree of impatience with it, and eagerness to keep it as low as possible, and to get rid of it as soon as possible. But I think we have to come out of this cost-centric mentality of income support. In a different context, I call it entitlement support, that you should give support to maintain the entitlements of people to food, education, medicine, and other livelihoods. So instead of looking at entitlement support as an unfortunate cost, we should look upon it as a positive tool for fighting the endemic. It's not a cost, it's an important tool. Like the medicines, like the vaccines, it is an important tool. It helps us to deal with the pandemic in a number of ways. First of all, is the obvious one, that if you give adequate entitlement support, it will avoid hunger, morbidity and mortality from hunger. So one of the costs of pandemic will be avoided. Not just that, it will also save life, not just from hunger, it will save life from virus itself. Because you see, why can't we maintain strict lockdown? Because people are eager to come out and work for a livelihood. And if you do that, the physical distances cannot be maintained, the virus will spread, it will cost lives. But if you give adequate entitlement support to the people so that they don't feel the necessity to come out prematurely to work, then you will be able to maintain a lockdown, and this will save lives from virus as well. So the entitlement support not only saves lives from hunger, it also saves lives from the virus itself. In this way, it resolves the so-called trade-off between lives and lives. People say we are facing a trade-off between lives from the danger of hunger and lives from the danger of virus. But entitlement support of sufficient magnitude ensures that this trade-off is not faced, because you reduce both types of deaths by giving entitlement support. The other perspective is that you think it's the cost to the economy, but the economies actually will be benefited in many different ways if we can provide a large degree of entitlement support. Now you see, pandemic has caused loss of output. Most countries' GDP has shrunk, or GDP growth has not considerably slowed. To some extent, it is inevitable. Because if you impose a lockdown, which you must, then by definition, production goes down. So some part of the loss of output is unavoidable. But there are other elements of loss of output which can occur, but which are in principle avoidable. So, for instance, when you're trying to open up the economy, you want the economic production to resume, but you find that even if you in principle open up the economy is not picking up because people have lost their purchasing power. There is now a demand constraint. The initial problem was a supply constraint, that government is stopping supply. But once you try to open up the economy can face a demand constraint because people don't have the purchasing power. But if you have given enough entitlement support to the people, then that itself would have created the demand, which would then allow the economy to move forward once it begins to open up. Then again, you are beginning to open up the economy. You want to labor force to come back to work. Labor force may come back, but if they have been without food, without nutrition, without medicine for so long, what kind of labor force is going to come back? The labor force that is going to come back will be famished, emaciated, weak. Some of them would have actually died. So can you resume normal economic activity with a labor force that is weak, hungry, and emaciated? So entitlement support of a large magnitude can help not only to avoid deaths of both kinds, death from hunger and death from virus, it can also contribute positively to growth of economic output once the economy begins to open up. So entitlement support to the poor people should be seen in a positive light as one of the vital tools for fighting the pandemic, not as an unfortunate cost imposed by the pandemic. This change of perspective, in my view, is essential in order to deal with the pandemic effectively. Thank you very much. And I hope I'm not taking too long, Celine. And
Not
thank
at
you very
all.
much for organizing this conference. It has been most valuable.
Not at all, Professor Isar Usmani. I think it was extremely intervention from your side as a chair of the session. At the beginning and also towards the end, I think the discussion of or the presentations were extremely useful and I think very interesting, thought-provoking. And I think the session was a very, it contributed quite a lot to our conference, and I personally learned a lot. So I must thank you, Professor Rusmani, as well as the presenters and the discussant. And also, I thank the participants for being with us in this conference. We have two more sessions. One just, I think, will start in 25 minutes from now, and another one in the evening. So I welcome you all to those two sessions too. And with this, I'd like to conclude this session. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. My pleasure.